What's up, y'all? It's Mr. Canada. In this video, we're going to be continuing our discussion about how to write and find the domain and range of a function, but we're going to be focusing more on continuous functions. This will be two parts because there are two different types of examples that I want to cover, but if I cover both, the video is going to be too long. So definitely check out the second part after watching this first part. Let's go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and recap. What's the domain and what's the range? So domain is the group of all of the x values or all of the inputs from our function, and the range we discussed was all of the y values or all of the outputs from our function. Now, before we move forward about how to write the domain for this new particular types of functions, we want to first talk about what a continuous function is. Basically, a continuous function is a number or any set of numbers that can take any value between an interval. Basically, think of it this way. If I have an endpoint and I have a second endpoint, a continuous function can have any number in between those two endpoints. So for example, an example of a real life thing that's continuous is time. Time can be broken down into seconds, and it can also be built up into hours, days, months, millenniums, you name it. So time can take out any value in between the smallest value to the biggest possible value. Time is always a great example of something being continuous. Likewise, another great example of continuous would be your height. When you're born of a certain height. Maybe you're a little bit smaller than others, maybe you're a little bit taller than others. But as we grow, we're always growing in small increments, and our height is always different as we're growing until we get to a stopping point, in which case we no longer grow anymore. In that case, we had a very distinct starting point and a very distinct ending point in our height, and we can say that between these two numbers, we're at some height between that interval of heights. So that's basically what the continuous function is that it can have any sort of values between a finite or an infinite interval. So let's keep that in mind when we're trying to find a domain and range for these. Now, is the way that we're going to be writing the domain and range for these continuous graphs the same for the discrete graphs? Absolutely not. It's going to have its own special way of writing it. And there's a lot of ways that you can write it. But the way that we're going to be talking about in this course is going to be something that we call interval notation. Check this out. So interval notation is basically you have an inequality sign like the one in the following, like this one. And basically our whole goal is that we want to look for two endpoints. We want to look for the first number, and then we want to look for the second number. So we want to look for a number that goes here, and we also want to know a number that goes here, and what goes in the middle depends on what you're trying to look for. If it's domain, it's going to be x, and if it's the range, it's going to be y. So let's go ahead and see how this interval notation works out in action. So I'm going to go ahead and write this as interval notation. Let's go ahead and practice interval notation with a couple of examples. So look at this example right here. This example has the following graph. A couple of things that you should notice is that a graph is continuous if between any 2 points there's not a break or a hole between that straight line. It's just a clean straight line. It's not broken up in any way in between. So how exactly do we write the domain and range for something like this? It's actually pretty easy. So let's keep this in mind. When you're asked to find a domain of a continuous graph, it's easy to think about what your left endpoint is and consider what your right endpoint is. I like to think of it like reading a book. I'm going to start reading from the left, and then I'm going to stop reading at the right. So we're always starting from left to right and thinking about what your x values are at the left and at the right. So for example, here, what is the x value of your left endpoint? Well, here's my left endpoint. My x value going up to the x-axis is -2. So we can say that my left endpoint is going to be -2. Now, because this dot here is circled, colored in, or we might also call it solid, we're going to be using this inequality symbol. Whenever you have a colored in dot, we're going to be using the inequality with an equal to sign, meaning that we can include that value. So we're going to draw the inequality with the line. X goes in the middle because we're talking about the domain. And now we're going to think about what is my right endpoint? What's the x value at my right endpoint? Here, If I go all the way down, my x value is 2. So that means that I'm going to go ahead and put 2 as my right endpoint. And again, I put the inequality sign with the equal to because it is colored in at that point. So this is how you find a domain. You start from the left and you end at the right. And then you pay attention to see what kind of symbol we're going to be using. Okay, so how does the range work? To find the range, we're going to be using a similar thing. Range is found using the following trick. To find range, we're going to be thinking about the lowest point, and we need to think about the highest point. Once we locate the lowest point and the highest point, then we're going to be focusing on the y value of that low point and high point, because range deals with all of the y values or all of the outputs. So let's go ahead and see how that works out. Well, where is the lowest point on my graph? Well, my lowest point would be located down here. Now, how do we know for sure that's the lowest point? Well, there's no other point or line that's smaller than this. So this has to be the lowest point. Okay, so then what's my y value there? My y value there is -1, so that means this is going to be -1. That is the y value of the lowest point. Because it's colored in, we're going to go ahead and use the inequality with the line. This time we put y in the middle because we're talking about range. And now all we have to do is find the highest point. My highest point is up here, and again, how do we know whether that's the highest? Well, there's nothing bigger than that on my graph. So what's my y value over here? Well, my y value here is 7, so that means that I'm going to put 7 as my highest point, and I'm going to put the inequality with the line again because it is colored in. So what's the big idea? If you want to find domain, you start from the left and you end at the right, focus on the x values, and if you want to find your range, you look at the lowest point and then at the highest point, and you only focus on the y of those points, and then you write them down using the correct symbol. So let's look at another example. Notice that with this example, the endpoints here are not solid dots. They're empty dots. So something to remember is that whenever you have an empty dot, you're going to be using the inequality symbol that does not have the equal to sign. Basically, it means that even though you can get close to that value, you can't actually include it in your domain or range. So does that change how we're going to write our answer? Yeah, it just changes how we're going to be, which inequality we use, but it doesn't change how we find those numbers. So let's find a domain first. Our domain, remember, is from left and then to right. So here's my left. My left x here is -4, so I'm going to put -4. Because it's not colored in, I'm going to be using the inequality without the line. X in the middle. Now let's go to the right. My right is over here. If I look at the x value, it's 3. So that means this is going to be 3. And again, because it's not colored in, I want to use the inequality sign without the equal to. That was pretty easy. Now let's go ahead and find the range. Range, remember, deals with y. So that means we look at the lowest point first, and then we look at the highest point afterwards. So the lowest point is not on this side of the graph this time, but it's down here. This is the lowest point of the graph. So what's my y value here? Well, my y value here is -4. So this is going to be -4. Because it's not colored in, I put the inequality sign without the line, and then I look for my highest point. The highest point is up here. What's my y value? My y value is 3. So this is going to obtain a value of 3, and I don't put the line on my inequality sign. It's not a lot of work. If anything, you're only working a couple of seconds to look for the numbers. The only thing you have to be careful about is where you're looking to find your numbers and using the correct sign when you're writing down your answer. Let's look at a few more examples. Look at this next example. So notice that we have a mix of a solid dot and an open dot. That's okay. Basically, that means that we're going to be using 2 different symbols in our answer. Let's go ahead and start with domain first. So our domain, left, and then over to right. So here's the left. My x value here is -3. So we're going to put -3 here. Because it's colored in, we're going to put the line at the bottom. X goes in the middle. What's my right endpoint? Well, here's my right. And my x value there is +3. Because it's not colored in, I don't put the line at the bottom. There's your domain. Now, how do we know how to write the range? Well, again, we start from the lowest point and then we move up to the highest point. Here's my lowest point. My y value at the lowest point is -1. We include it with the line because it's a solid dot, and now we look at the highest point. This is my highest point. My y value there is +3. So that means I'm going to put y here, and I end with 3. And because it's not colored in, I just put the inequality sign without the line. And there you have it, domain and range for this example. Let's go ahead and do one more. So here in this example, again, we have a mix of inequality symbols. So let's do domain first. So left to right. At the left, here we have this point, and if we go all the way down to find our x, it's right here at 0. So this is going to be 0. It's empty, so I don't include the line. And then I go to the right. Here's my right endpoint. What's the x value right here? Well, it's right on top of it. It's going to be 5. And because it's colored in, I do include the line. So I am including that value of 5. Okay, now let's look for the range. With the range, we start from the lowest and we end at the highest. So where is my lowest point here? Well, my lowest point is located down here. We're interested in finding the y value, not the x value. So you might make the mistake of putting a 5 here, but be careful about that, where they're asking us to find y. So we're going to go drawing a blue line all the way over here to the y-axis, and again the value here is 0. So I'm going to put 0 here, but because this is colored in, I need to put the symbol with the line on it. Y goes in the center. Now let's look for the highest point. The highest point is right here at 4. So that means that this is going to end at 4, and because it's empty, we make sure that we don't include the line. Now, how do we know whether we're putting the inequality signs for all of these instead of just listing the points out? Now, you might be tempted to just do this for a lot of these, because from a discrete graph, we were talking about, well, we have a whole bunch of points, we can just list them out, and that's true. Something that I see sometimes is that people like to do this. They like to put points on the graph that aren't there. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does set you up to making a mistake, because then you're going to be thinking that, oh, these are the only 5 points on that red line, which is not true at all. Because we can also say that in between those points, there are also points that are not on an exact number. But even between those points, we have more points that are in between those. So as you can see, from just 5 of those points, we can still be thinking about points that are in between those two, and then there's points between those, and then there's points between those. This is the reason why we don't want to write the domain in the range one by one, because you basically have an infinite number of points that you could write down. And let's just pretend that you use up all the space there. I could still go ahead and zoom in microscopically small and still write down points that are in there. This is the reason why we need to put inequalities instead of listing out the numbers one by one, because we want to include all of the points right away without worrying about, oh, did I miss one, or oh, did I draw enough points? So let's recap here. What's the difference between a continuous graph and a discrete graph? Continuous graphs, basically, they're connected points. There's going to be a graph between them, whether it be a line or anything else. Now, to write the domain of a continuous graph, or the range of a continuous graph, you're going to be writing it down using interval notation. Basically, you're thinking about endpoints. To find a domain, you start from the left and you end at the right. You're only focusing on x. To find the range, you're looking at the lowest point and then finishing up at the highest point, and you're only focusing on the y value in that case. And then the only thing you have to make sure is, are we using the correct inequality symbol? If it's colored in, then you want to write the inequality symbol with the equal to. And if it's open or not colored in, then you want to use the inequality sign that does not have the equal to symbol. And it's okay if there is a mix of symbols in your answer. You just want to make absolutely sure that you have the right one. Well, I hope you guys learned something new today. If you liked the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel for more Algebra 1 videos. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below and I'll get to you as soon as I can. And like always, please take care and I'll see you guys next time.